do is to try and get rid of this kind of problem. We also have to take a look at short-term exposure to particulate matter in the state, because the American Lung Association also looks at that. And short-term is over the course of a single 24-hour period, not just individual exceedances. And when you look at it that way, we have actually 10 of the top 20 worst places in the country for short-term particulate matter pollution. Not a good deal. It's definitely something we don't want to deal with. In order to combat that, the Air Resources Board identified diesel particulate matter as something called a toxic airborne contaminant back in 1998. I know that's ancient history. I know you probably are not worried about what happened in 1998, but I'm telling you right here, right now, that if that identification wasn't made, none of the diesel regulations that have been passed would have actually been passed. They wouldn't have happened because this designation had to be put in place first. That designation requires that the substance be dangerous and contain harmful chemicals. And in this case, diesel particulate matter was shown to be potentially responsible for up to 70% of all the known airborne cancer risks in the state of California. So once that designation was made, the Air Resources Board staff were tasked with creating some kind of plan to deal with getting rid of this substance out of our air. And that plan was called the Diesel Risk Reduction Plan. It was published in the year 2000, and it had two major things that were part of it. One that's not shown here were goals. These were goals on reducing particulate matter. The first goal was to be a 75% reduction by the year 2010. And then the second goal was to have another 10% reduction, so 85% total by the year 2020. And these are from 1990 levels. Now, both those years have passed. So did we meet the goals? Well, we know we met the 2010 goal. I personally have not seen any data that supports the fact that we met the 2020 goal. So until I see that, I can't tell you that we did that. But that was half the document. The other half of the document actually set goals for how we were going to meet. Not goals. They set parameters for how we were going to meet the goals. And the three parameters are shown right here. The first was making the engines cleaner, the new engines cleaner. Now that certification program exists at federal EPA. They have primary control for certifying new engines across the United States. The Air Resources Board also has a certification program, but we pretty much mimic or mirror what the feds do. We're not allowed to make things more stringent without their permission. The second leg or mechanism used to meet our goals was cleaning up diesel fuel. Now, you may or may not know this, but I've been around for a long time, so I remember this. But diesel fuel has not been very clean in the past. In fact, it was at one point considered a throwaway type of fuel. But it is very useful, and it's traditionally has high sulfur content. Now, sulfur content is a problem because of two reasons. Sulfur doesn't burn very well, so anytime you put anything in a combustion process where it doesn't burn very well, you're going to produce smoke and have issues. The second reason that it's a problem is because a lot of the new control technology that we're using to help mitigate these emissions are sensitive to sulfur pollution. So we had to get sulfur out of the fuel. That's why back in the early 90s, the Air Resources Board basically required that diesel fuel have no more than 15 parts per million of sulfur content in it. That was also adopted by the federal EPA. So now across this country, you should not be able, and you have not been able to, for some time, been able to produce, store, transport, or sell or import any diesel fuel that had a higher sulfur content than 15 parts per million. And to give you an idea of how low that is, when I first started at the Air Resources Board, it was not uncommon to see diesel sulfur samples come back with, 50,000 ppm or 100,000 ppm. They were really high numbers. All right, so those two mechanisms are both across the country. The third mechanism here is actually something that currently really happens mainly in California, because we have such an issue that I've shown you already. But that third mechanism is this, and that is that we are requiring that if you're going to use older technology, older engines, that you do one of two things. You either clean them up so they don't produce as much of the problem pollutants, or you drop them into a low use so that they don't, again, produce as much of the issue. That can be done through the installation of filtration systems. In fact, in this language here, you see the phrase Verified Diesel Emission Control Strategies, or VDECs. Verified Diesel Emission Control Strategies is just a long way of saying filter. So whenever somebody gives you that phrase, that is a diesel particulate filter. A lot of our regulations have required the installation, including this one, of diesel particulate filters. So for this rule, transport refrigeration engines, which is what we're talking about here, are considered off-road engines. There are four basic types of engines that EPA certifies. You've got on-road mobile, that would be the main engine that drives vehicles and trucks. You've got off-road mobile, which would be the main engine that drives things like tractors, backhoes, and bulldozers. You've got stationary engines. These would be engines that, because you can understand the word, they don't move. And then you've got portable engines, and these are engines that actually move, but they don't provide any motive force. So they're not actually driving a vehicle. That's what a TRU engine is. It's considered a portable engine. And in order to determine that it's truly off-road, one of the things that our inspectors do is they take a look at something called an emissions control label. When we do an inspection of a TRU, we actually are looking at the label for that engine. And we try to make a determination that it's the right engine, the right model year, and that it's designated as an off-road piece of equipment. Now, how do you do that? So this slide is really designated to give you some ideas, because we need to understand what's off-road and what's on-road, and what's portable and what's stationary, because all of our regulations are designed to regulate a specific type of engine. If you have an on-road engine, it's in the on-road regulatory program. If you have off-road engines, they're in the off-road regulatory program. Same with portable and stationary. So in order to determine that, you need a little bit of information. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to look at something called the emission control label. Every engine is supposed to, currently manufactured and for some time, is supposed to have a label like this somewhere on the engine itself. It gives you information about the certification standard that that engine was built to. And in this case, you can look at one here that is for an off-road engine. How do I know this? Well, I can read down at the bottom where it says this engine conforms to 2000 US EPA and California regulations for large non-road compression ignition engines. I don't need to look any further. I know this is a 2000, a 2000 model year engine because it says it is. I know that it's an off-road engine because it says large non-road compression ignition. I should tell you that the federal government uses different language than the state of California does. When we talk about an engine like this, we call it an off-road engine. They use one of two other terms. That's either non-road or off-highway. We've kind of combined them because they pretty much mean the same thing, and we use off-road. So if you hear any one of those three phrases, off-road, off-highway, or non-road, they all mean basically the same thing. In this case, we also want to look at, if you don't have that text at the bottom, you can find the same information by looking up the engine family. On the slide, you can see the engine family. It's listed right there, kind of the top left of the image of that ECL. And you can see that it's 12 digits. All standardized family names, engine family names, are 12 digits. And each digit represents the same piece of information. The first digit is always the model year. So we already know this is a 2000 model year engine. Now we know that because the first letter of the family name is Y, that every engine with a Y in the first digit is going to be a 2000 model year engine. The next three digits, PKX, that represents the manufacturer. It's a three-letter designation the federal government has assigned for Perkins. So all Perkins engines are going to say PKX in those next three slots. The fifth slot is an L in this case, and that is the most common designation or designated letter for off-road equipment. So even if I didn't have the text, because there's an L there, I can look it up on EPA's website, and sure enough, they'll tell me that's an off-road engine. The next digits, there's four digits in a row there, 03.9, and the decimal point is one of the digits. that represents the displacement. So this is a 3.9 or 4-liter engine. And then the last 3 digits, AK1, are just the manufacturer's model number for this particular engine. Anyway, that's how you read a family name. This is the kind of information that our inspectors look for when they're looking at your tags. There's another example right here. This shows an on-road engine manufactured by Caterpillar, and it's to a 2008 standard. Well, how do I know these things? Because it says so on the label. You can see there's a 2008 in the top right-hand corner. There's also 2008 down in the text at the bottom. But even if I didn't have that, the family name is right there in bold letters. It starts with an 8. In this case, for the 2008 model year engine, they started with numbers again instead of letters. So 8 represents 2008. CPX is a 3-letter designation for Caterpillar, so all Caterpillar engines are going to say CPX. And the 5th letter on this one says H. So H is the most commonly used letter for on-highway. So this is an on-road engine. And then the displacement on this one says 0928. There's no decimal point because the manufacturers get to choose what type of measurement that they use. So, the Perkins engine decided to use liters. This engine is using cubic centimeters. So they list it that way. And then E1X is the last 3 digits of this particular engine family name. All right, that's kind of a sidebar. If you need more information on family naming conventions, here's a link for federal EPA's website that you can do a search for all family names. Now, the actual link is written out on the bottom there, but I would suggest that if you just go to epa.gov, that's their main website, and in the search box on the top right, where it has the little magnifying glass image on there, you can put in engine family name, and this is one of the top hits that comes up. Okay. Enough preamble. Let's get into the actual TRU regulation. What does it require? Who must comply? And what are the basic requirements? So this rule applies to all diesel-powered TRUs, transport refrigeration units, and TRU gensets that are operating in California. So if I'm an out-of-state owner-operator and I drive my truck into California and it has a TRU on it, then this rule applies to that piece of equipment while it's in our state. That might be a relatively new thought for some people because how are we able to enforce rules on vehicles that don't reside here, people that don't live in the state? Well, they're operating in our state, and federal EPA has given us that authority, so we have that authority. So it's applicable to out-of-state fleets and companies as long as they are operating here. This rule also has requirements for operators of California terminals where any of this kind of equipment is garaged, maintained, or dispatched. So if you have large areas, large yards where TRU and TRU gensets are, then the operators of the terminals actually have some requirements to report under this regulation. This regulation was also one of the very first ones where we introduced the idea of requirements for what are called freight brokers, forwarders, shippers, and receivers. These entities may not own any of the equipment. They don't own trucks necessarily with TRUs or anything related to the rule. However, they hire the use of those trucks. So in the language of this rule, it specifically says that if you're going to hire a truck to do work in California that has one of these TRUs, you need to ensure that you're hiring a compliant vehicle and piece of equipment. I'll show you some tools how to do that a little bit later, but that's part of the rule. And the way that works is if we find a TRU during one of our inspections that is not compliant with this rule, one of the things we can do is ask the operator basically where they came from, who sent them, who hired them. Legally, they're required to give us that information. Once we have that information, we go back to the whoever hired this driver. And if they can't prove to us that they did anything to determine that truck's compliance, they will also get the same citation. All right, so that's who must comply. What is the basic compliance? Now, the basic compliance was to clean the equipment up. TRUs have been traditionally fairly dirty pieces of equipment. So this rule requires them to clean up. Now, clean up was done in 2 stages, and the stages are listed at the bottom. the first stage was to take whatever it is that you have in operation and make it meet what are called low emission TRU standards. I'll tell you what that is in just a second, but that was the first step. And then 7 years after you did that, you would have to make that same equipment meet ultra low emission TRU standards. So there was 2 steps. They each separate by 7 years. And then once you completed that 7-year cycle and were ultra low emission TRU, you're done with this rule. Now, what are LE True and ULE True? LE True meant that you did a basic installation of a level 2 diesel particulate filter. Now, there are actually 3 levels of filtration systems, 3 being the best, but 2 was an interim step, and it was capable of removing 50% or up to 50% of all the soot coming from the engine. So this was a good medium step for TRUs. You could also, if you had a smaller engine, like less than 25 horsepower, a lot of these engines are less than 24 horsepower, Tier 4 met the standard for LE True. If it was a 25 to 50 horsepower engine, then Tier 4 interim had to be installed in order to meet the standard. I'm using the word tier, and hopefully everybody in the audience has at least some idea of what that is. Tier is just a designation that is put on off-road, off-highway engines that designates their certification standard. There's a whole chart that shows you what the different tiers are, but it's essentially a comparison between the model year of the engine and a horsepower category. All right, so that's LE True. Let's look at ULE True. This is the ultimate standard for this rule. If whatever you had in LE True, the next step after 7 years was to either install a level 3 diesel particulate filter, which can remove a minimum of 85% of all the soot, or you had to have a Tier 4 final 25 to 50 horsepower engine. These were started being built and available by 2013. Now, there was also the possibility of doing something that was called alternative technology. And this is where this rule kind of shows its true colors as to what it was designed to do. Because this rule is more or less a rule against idling. And if that doesn't make sense to you, think about it when you look at how TRUs are used. You've got one of these refrigeration units. It's on a trailer to refrigerate the goods in that trailer. They transport the material or probably foodstuffs in that trailer from one location to another, but then they spend a significant amount of time just sitting there idling while the trailer is either loaded or offloaded. When it's sitting there, that's idling, and that is when it causes the most problems for whoever has to live and work around where these centers are that they are at. So alternative technology could have been and has been for some people designing your equipment so that you could just plug it in when you were stopped somewhere, so that it was running on electricity, not diesel fuel, when it was at that drop-off location. We've had some alternative technology systems where they used refrigerants that were different, so they didn't have to use as much fuel, or they were tied to the main engine, so it was a power takeoff type of deal. There were lots of different attempts to do this, but the rule allowed for that as long as the system that you installed met the ultimate level of control. I told you that it was a 7-year cycle for this regulation. I wanted to show you what that cycle looked like. So if you had, the oldest engine on here is a 2002. If you had a 2002 engine when we put this rule in place, then you had to meet ULE True or LE True standards by 2009, 7 years. And then you had to meet ULE True standards with that same engine by 2016, another 7 years. It's the same for everything on this chart. Earlier in the day, I told you that this rule was fully implemented, and that's because we are now past 7 years from the 2013 time frame when all engines of this size were coming as Tier 4 final engines. A Tier 4 final engine is ULE True. It meets the ULE True standard. So right now here today in California, we should not have any engines, any TRU engines running around that don't meet a minimum of 2013, or they have a filter on them, or they're plug-in. Those are the options that you should see the most. All right. I just wanted to give it to you two different ways. This is just a little bit different way of looking at it, but it still includes the 7-year cycle that I was mentioning. And the other part of this regulation involves a reporting system and a labeling requirement. So the reporting system that was associated with the TRU regulation is a system called Arbor. This is one of the older database type systems that ARB has. It's been around for a long time, and it was utilized to house the reporting system for this regulation. Basically, if you have a California-based TRU, you are required to report that TRU into the Arbor system. If you have an out-of-state based TRU, this rule did not require you to report that. Now, a lot of them did because they knew they were going to be operating in the state, but they weren't legally required to. That's going to come up later when I talk about future regulation. So the Arbor system, once you report a unit, will create what's called an identification number, or IDN, for each unit, and that IDN will be randomized and different for each unit. It is the responsibility of the owner of the unit then to affix or paint these numbers, these identification numbers, on the housing of the TRU, on both sides of the housing. And it has to be of a contrasting color. So in the examples here, I've got white housing, black letters are perfect. You look at the left one, there is some kind of silverish lettering on there that's not part of our lettering, but that's very difficult to read. So that would not be acceptable as far as the requirements of this regulation. All these IDNs are the same number of digits, and they all start with the ARB as the first 3 letters. And they can be installed or painted, if you will, in a horizontal or vertical fashion, either way. There you go. All right. When are you required to report? Well, you're required to initially report. If you're a California-based TRU, it has to be in this Arbor system in order to be legal. And then when you achieve compliance, when you make the TRU engine ultra-low emission TRU compliant, you're supposed to go in there and report how that was achieved. Also, if you get rid of the unit, whether you sold or scrapped it or whatever you did with it, you have to go in and report that that unit is inactive and how it became inactive. Now, if you have problems with the reporting system, we do have a group of people and a dedicated helpline just for this system. So you can call that number that's shown on the screen. All right, I did tell you that there were some basic broker motor carrier requirements, so I wanted to go through that a little bit more. We'll talk about these 3 areas, and hopefully you get more of the idea. First of all, I also wanted to tell you what we're looking at, what the broker should be looking at. So for the TRU, we're looking at the engine of the unit, we're looking at registration of the unit, and we're looking at labeling. For comparison purposes, I put up some of the other regulations that ARB has that also have reporting systems and what they actually have as part of their requirements. So, for example, you can see that the truck and bus regulation there's no reporting required in that or labeling required. It's a possibility, but the engine has to be compliant with the standards of the rule. It's a little bit different because TRUs, that one requires that the engine's compliant, that it's registered, and that it's labeled. So you have to be a little bit cognizant that some of our rules require different things. So as far as information requirements, the brokers are required to provide the following information to every driver that they're going to have in California. They got to put their business name, where they're located, and some way of contacting a specific person at that location. The person's name as well as their phone number. The driver, their responsibility is to have that information and to give it to inspectors when they're asked for it. They don't have to automatically just give it to them, but they have to provide it to authorized personnel. They will also need to provide their information so we know who they are for any freight that's transported in the state of California. How do you stay out of trouble with this broker dispatcher requirement? Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of help here because there are some mechanisms you can use. They might involve an annual notice to carriers, or you send out some to your regular carriers that this is a requirement, we need this information. Maybe require in any of your carriers to have a reporting system printout. I'll show you that in just a second. Maybe including something in your bid language for your contracts for any services that you're using that might involve the use of a TRU. Bold language on freight documents that designates that you're in compliance, or that your vehicles are in compliance, the ones that you're hiring. And then we do have some online resources. So I know this is very small text. I don't necessarily need you to be able to read everything that's on the slide. I just needed to make sure you could see what a whole printout looks like from the Arbor system. So this is an Arbor certification page. It's actually 2 pages, and the information about the unit and the owners on the first page. And the only thing that I really want you to pay attention to on the second page is highlighted in bright red, and that's whether it's compliant or not compliant. If it's not compliant, it's going to say it right there on the second sheet. You can see it in red, says not compliant. To give you an idea of what a compliant one looks like, has the same kind of information on the front half, but down at the very bottom of the second page, it says compliant ULI true. So this company and this unit are in full compliance with this version of the regulation. And these are something that you can print out from the Arbor reporting system. What about making sure that all the bids that you have for jobs in the state of California only involve compliant equipment? Well, you can require that any company bidding on your work demonstrates compliance with regulations. That's actually very common in a lot of contractual arrangements where there is a clause that says you are responsible for maintaining compliance with all known regulation. We have people that say that just about ARB. You could also go one step further and require them to give you a list of any of the identification numbers for the equipment that they're going to use to conduct your work. Here's some suggested language. I don't know that I want you to use this specifically, but it does work. It lists the regulation, where it is in the California Code of Regulations, the actual section of code, and it also gives you an alternative possibility for the IDN numbers. Okay. Now that's the whole of the TRU regulation. I told you it wasn't very much because we're already, as I said, past the point where it's fully implemented. So at this point, again, you need to have a TRU. If you're operating in California, it has to be ultra low emission TRU, which means typically one of 3 things. It's either Tier 4 final, or you have a level 3 diesel particulate filter installed on something that's not Tier 4 final, or you have some alternative technology that allows you to operate at the same low emission rate. That isn't the end of the story, though, because as you know, our agency is still a regulatory agency. We're still going other steps, and the next step for most of our regulations is to make them zero emission based. And transport refrigeration systems or units are going that direction. So there is a TRU regulation concept under development. It is trying to push every use of TRUs in the state of California towards some type of zero emission technology. We're doing that with the truck engines as well. There'll be a PM standard for newly manufactured TRU engines, maybe even a refrigerant with a lower global warming potential. That just means it's made of something that will have less of an issue with global warming. These are all happening right now. And I say that with an emphasis, hopefully, that it's not a done deal yet. Whenever I teach this class, I want people to understand that we're in the process right now. This is the time, if you can, that you should actually be participating in the regulatory process if you want to make changes that are positive for your own type of fleet.
Randy?
Okay. Yes. Okay.
You do have a question.
All right.
So if a reefer comes into, it's based outside of California, but comes into California periodically on a trip with a fuel permit, are they required to report that reefer?
No, if it's not based in California, there is no reporting requirement. They're just required to have the engine in full compliance with the ULI True standard. They don't have to be labeled. They don't have to be reported. Just compliant with the emission requirements. That's a good question, though, to add to that, because I'm talking about the TRU next steps. One of the other things that they're considering in this new TRU regulation, and I'm sure this is going to actually be part of it, is having all TRUs, whether they're out of state or in state, require reporting. So in the future, the reporting labeling is going to be required of every vehicle that comes in the state of California, every TRU. So, but right now it's not. All right. The next steps, again, for TRU, there's supposed to be a board hearing. Actually, there was supposed to be a board hearing in September of 2021. I don't remember if that actually happened, but if it didn't, they're looking to have it happen sometime before the end of this year. And then there's going to be a second rulemaking part for this, where they actually get more into the actual how to convert things to electric zero emission type trailers. If you need more information, there's a link there for you to follow, and we have other slides that Katie's going to show you when I get done with my material. Actually, I should have X'd this out. They're not doing this part anymore, so close your eyes. Don't pay attention to the slide. It shouldn't be there. I do want to make sure you have some online resources for checking compliance. This is if you're hiring somebody. And to that end, I also wanted to give you the links for other online resources that are related to other regulations that we have. So you have online resources for the truck and bus rule, for the greenhouse gas rule, for the off-road regulation, and for the drayage truck regulation. But the one that's highlighted in the middle is what's called the 100% compliant carrier list for transport refrigeration units. This is, again, a link that will allow you to get into the Arbor system, put in some information about the TRU that you have or the owner of the TRU, and you should be able to get, if they're compliant and reported, you should be able to get some information as to whether or not you can hire them based on that. All right, that's all TRU. Let's talk a little bit about enforcement and how this works, because we do inspections, we have field staff, we also have audit staff. Field staff, first of all, why are they doing this? Why do we have field staff? Well, enforcement has to be a major component of every regulation that we write. Otherwise, people just wouldn't comply. We have to have a field presence so people know that we're serious about it. And we want to make sure that it's a level playing field. That's the idea. We don't want some people to not comply and other people to comply, because the people that are complying are spending money and taking time to make their vehicles and equipment compliant. We want to make sure that's across the board. Who does this enforcement? Well, as I said, we have our own ARB inspectors. We also have staff auditors that work in the office, and we have agreements with other agencies. In fact, Katie used to work for the San Diego Air Pollution Control District, and they were under contract with our agency to do inspections for TRUs in San Diego County. When I say it's inspection, what do I mean? I'm not just talking about the TRU. We look at everything that we have the legal right to look at. So we look for excessive smoke. We look for that emission control label that I was talking about earlier. We look for obvious signs that the emission control systems have been tampered with. We look for the use of an illegal diesel fuel. That's an interesting one, because we don't actually have a regulation in the state of California that deals with red dye diesel. But we're under contract with the IRS to do inspections for vehicles that are illegally using red dye diesel for on-road purposes. We also monitor excessive idling of equipment in a variety of locations, and whatever regulation applies to the equipment, whether it be a TRU regulation or the drayage or truck and bus or whatever it is, we will apply the requirements to every truck that we see, as long as they are applicable. For non-compliant fleets, we do identify them through field inspections, but we also identify them through audits. And for a lot of the on-road stuff, we're looking at registration information, because we have a direct connection with DMV. We also get a lot of calls on that 1-800-ED-SMOG number from people who are seeing things they think are bad or wrong. And we usually investigate those to find out what the truth is. Penalties for non-compliance can be any amount. They can be a zero amount, they can be $500, they can be $1 million, depends on the circumstance. Generally speaking, our penalty structure is so much per month until we have some type of sit down or a meeting with the person or company that we're citing to find out exactly what happened. And it's a fact-finding mission. The penalties can go up or down based on what information we receive from the people that we're talking with. If we don't get any action as far as that is concerned, we also can put DMV registration holds on any on-road vehicle that has come into California. All right, I want to briefly talk about the periodic smoke inspection program because I did mention smoke, and excessive smoke is one of the inspectors' things that they look at. We do inspections and tests on the smoke coming from the main engine as well as the TRU. However, there is another program that you need to be aware of that requires you to do the same thing. So the smoke test is simply putting a meter into the stack and measuring how much of the diesel smoke, the pollutant, is actually coming from that engine. We use it as a tool out in the field, but if you meet certain conditions, you're supposed to perform the same test on each of your vehicles every year. And we ask for the test results periodically when we're doing investigations. These are the things that you have to meet in order to have this requirement. First of all, it's only for California-based on-road fleets and diesel fleets. So it's California-based on-road diesel fleets. You have to have at least 2 trucks, so 2 or more. The trucks have to be more than 6,000 pounds gross weight. And if you meet those 3 conditions, California-based, 2 or more, over 6,000, you have this requirement. Which vehicles do you test? We're requiring you to test anything that has an engine model year that is 4 years old or older. Once per year, you're required to do this test. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking about this particular program right now in a TRU class is because the opacity levels changed back in 2017, and they've gone down. And it's related to the use of diesel particulate filters, which are also on the TRUs. We needed to set those opacity levels lower because the filtration systems are capable of dropping the particulate levels down substantially. We did that. We lowered the levels. We instituted new tester training requirements and also allowed for voluntary OBD submittal. I'll talk about OBD in just a second. And have a proposed testing upon vehicle sale. The new opacity levels for any on-road diesel vehicle, the main engine, are shown here. If you have a filter, no more than 5% opacity. And opacity is nothing more than the amount of light that's allowed to pass through the stack. The more smoke you can see, the higher the opacity. 5% would be just about at most people's visual sensitivity. So when you just start to see smoke, you're really close to that 5%. There are vehicles, of course, that don't have filtration systems on them because there are certain provisions that allow for that. So they will have higher allowances, but it's all based on the model year engine and what kind of equipment it is. Who's doing this testing? Well, you can hire somebody to do it, but if you do, that tester, the contracted smoke tester, is required to have completed a training, a certification class at one of 8 community colleges located throughout the state of California that belong to something called the California Council on Diesel Education and Technology, the CCDET program. This is a one-day training where they take you in, they show you how to do it, they tell you about the law, and they have you demonstrate that you know what you're doing. And that has to be recertified every 4 years. So if you're hiring somebody to do it, make sure you ask them for a copy of their certificate from that program and make sure that it is no more than 4 years of age. Otherwise, it's a non-valid test. If you are doing the test yourself on your own vehicles, or if you're having an employee do it for you, then that person has to have gone through an online training course. The course is called MS509. It's available on our learning management system, our LMS website. It's about, a couple of hours, and it's just all menu driven. It's all online. You'll get a certificate, you'll get a tester number, and then that tester number has to be put into the testing device itself in order to make it legal. Reporting. There currently isn't any reporting required for this regulation, for PSIP. We just require you to keep those opacity tests for 2 years and then have them available when or if we ask for them. There is an option for vehicles that are equipped with something called onboard diagnostics, or OBD. That's a long way of saying the computer system. So all of our vehicles these days have fancy computers that run everything. Part of the system is concerned strictly with the emission control units or systems that are on the engine to control the emissions, obviously. Those onboard diagnostics engines also have the capability of transmitting a file that we can use to determine compliance. So there is a reporting system associated with that. There's a guide that you can download right there and take a look at that. If you have newer trucks, these would be trucks that have a 2013 or newer model year engine. Katie will talk more about this, but there is a new program dealing with the testing of big off-road or on-road vehicles. It's called the Future Heavy Duty Inspection and Maintenance Program. It's in process. The regulation is going before our board at the end of this year. And we're in a comment period right now where if you have comments, you have to do it officially through the comment period website. But that should be instituted by 2023. I know you found out about this class one way or another from me probably sending you an email, but we do have a listserv where you can have your friends join if they need the same kind of information. This is the website for it. Just make sure that if you do this, you understand that we're going to be sending you emails on a regular basis. Here's some contact points for basically all the programs, or a lot of the programs that we have. Lots of different numbers, lots of different websites. And that was the last slide that I had for this presentation. Let's see, we're at 1:50, so I didn't even take an hour. If Katie wants to come on and do the last portion, we'll be done here probably a little bit after 2 o'clock.
All right, so we'll just quickly go through the upcoming proposed regulations for the Mobile Source Control Division at ARB. So again, this isn't a comprehensive list. This is just the ones that are related to the mobile source emission categories, which is what Randy and I work on. So the first one for today is Advanced Clean Fleets. This is a regulation that applies to off-road or on-road vehicles, So on-road vehicles with a gross vehicle weight rating of over 8,500 pounds. And then to be subject to this, you also have to operate either a public fleet, a drayage fleet, a high priority private fleet, or a federal fleet. So the high priority private fleets are fleets that have over 50 vehicles. They can dispatch over 50 vehicles, or if they make over $50 million in revenue annually, those are all considered high priority private fleets. So for the requirements on these, they vary based on what kind of fleet you have, but they all do revolve around a zero emission vehicle purchase requirement. So there's different percentages and goals depending on the type of fleet for zero emission vehicle purchases coming up. So the next workshop for this one, they actually just had one. I do think there might be, I thought there was another one scheduled, but it might not be on the books yet. I'll double check that when we go to the questions portion, but there is another one coming up, or the 26th is the right date. I did check that one. Okay, so 26th for small fleets. They'll talk about the issues specifically pertaining to small fleets for that one. We do have the meeting schedule link posted here, so you can sign up for that workshop if you want to attend it. You can also view all the past presentations, staff presentations, as well as the recordings from, I think, 2 of the previous meetings now. So they did start recording those workshops so that if people miss them, they can still get that information. You can also sign up for the listserv. That's the email subscription, and that'll let you know when there are new meetings scheduled or if there's been any movement on this regulation. So in 2022, when it goes to the board, it'll notify you of that sort of thing as well. We also have the off-road diesel regulation amendments. So the off-road diesel regulation refers to off-road vehicles that are 25 horsepower or greater and diesel powered. So typically we're looking at construction type equipment for this, backhoes, loaders, skid steers, things like that. And they are proposing amendments to that regulation. So the off-road diesel regulation is already in place, but they are talking about amending it. And the proposed amendments have to do with introducing a backstop on old equipment. So currently you can own Tier 0, Tier 1, Tier 2, any tier of equipment as long as it was in your fleet before a certain time. And the proposal includes a ban on those equipments completely. So we'll have to get rid of the Tier 0 through Tier 2 eventually equipment in the proposal. It also proposes extending the tier ban. So that's the adding vehicle restrictions for that regulation to include Tier 3 and Tier 4 interim. And the last amendment is for the elimination of the year-by-year low use option. So this one's set to go to the board at the end of 2022. It is very much in the works right now. So if you do want to participate in that regulatory process, that's the whole purpose of us introducing these regulations, just to notify people and hopefully get the stakeholders involved so we can make these regulations as applicable and manageable as possible. So we do have the meeting schedule available again. For that, again, there's the staff presentations available on there. I'm not sure if they have any recordings for theirs up yet. You can also sign up for the listserv, which is that email subscription, and they'll notify you of any movement on this regulation or new workshops that are scheduled. The zero emission forklift regulation is a proposed regulation to accelerate the adoption of zero emission forklifts. So this is for forklift fleets in California. It applies to both diesel and LSI fleets. LSI is large spark ignition or propane forklifts. And the proposal for this one is a phase out based on the model year. So eventually certain model years of forklifts will be phased out and no longer legally allowed to operate in California if this regulation is passed. Again, this one goes to the board at the end of 2022, so very much in the workshopping phase, taking information from stakeholders. So again, if you want to be involved, take a look at that meeting schedule, familiarize yourself with the previous staff presentations, sign up for the listserv to get email updates on when new workshops will be scheduled and any movement on this regulation. And then the last one for today, which Randy did touch on during the presentation, there are some changes coming to the TRU regulation. So the first one is the proposed amendments to the TRU ATCM, which is the air toxic control measure. They are considering zero emission TRUs. There's some shore power requirements that are being talked about, things like that, and a new PM standard for the non-truck TRU engines. So the first part, as Randy mentioned, was supposed to go to the board in September. We haven't heard much about that. And then part 2 is set to go to the board in 2024. So if you do want to keep up to date on this one, again, we have the meeting schedule link, which has all the previous staff presentations available, and also the listserv, which you can sign up for email updates for this topic. Those are the upcoming regulations. So with that, we'll open it up for questions.